This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it is Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. Thanks so much for being here. This episode of When Science Speaks is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter the most in their professional lives. And that journey often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication, boiling down complex topics to capture the attention of general audiences. If you're interested in getting a free resource to do just that, just go to complexitymadeclear.com and get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down but not dumb down complicated science and technical topics for general audiences. Well, it is such a wonderful pleasure to have Jaime Cohen on the show today. Jaime is the founder of The Right Words. She's an internationally recognized speaker, communications coach, and advisor. She's a LinkedIn Learning author, and she's a top LinkedIn creator whose communication-focused content has amassed millions of views. Jaime transforms high achievers into powerhouse communicators who get the job, land that promotion, build thought leadership online, and become stronger leaders. Jaime's superpower is showing people and companies who know what they want exactly how to get it. Her clients have become thought leaders on LinkedIn, been promoted quickly, built strong, efficient teams, and increased their salaries by more than $1.5 million. Jaime, thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for having me.
And, you are focused on such a fascinating high impact area. And one thing that I was particularly struck by when I was looking at all the work that you've done is you talk about people being articulate but not necessarily good communicators. And I thought that was such an interesting distinction that you were making. Can you share with listeners what the difference is there?
Absolutely. There are so many people that I hear say, I wish that I sounded better when I spoke, or I wish that I could sound like that person. And there are so many people who are beautiful speakers. The way that they put words to go together sounds like poetry. But then when you take a moment to listen and try to understand what it is they just said, you can't figure that out. And so there's a lot to be said about people who can bridge that gap, who can speak beautifully, but also in a way that is accessible to everyone else. But the difference between being articulate and being a good communicator is being articulate, speaking using a lot of big vocabulary words, and sometimes maybe even if we're talking about the scientific community, using esoteric language that's inaccessible to the average person, to the layman, versus being a good communicator, which is speaking in a language that your audience understands. So an example that I always give is that you could be the foremost expert on whatever topic in the world. And if you're speaking to an audience in English and they speak Spanish, they're not going to understand you. They're not stupid. They just don't speak English. And so you have to be able to translate for them or interpret for them what it is you're saying so that that information is accessible. And then you can have a conversation rather than just soliloquizing or just a one-way dialogue.
Great. That is so important. Thanks for fleshing out that distinction. As an expert in leadership communication, among other work that you do, what are common blind spots that leaders experience when they communicate within the organizations they lead? And maybe after we talk about that a little bit, how can leaders avoid those pitfalls?
The biggest thing is not listening enough, because when we're talking about strong communication, the most important part of that is listening, understanding not just what the person is saying, but what is their overarching goal? What is it that they want? And a lot of times leaders will say, well, I explained this perfectly. I couldn't have been any more clear. And that, from their perspective, I can understand why they would say that. They laid out exactly what needed to be done and how it needed to be done, but they didn't take into account, how does that person like to be spoken to? How do they best receive information? Were you extremely clear over email or over the phone, but the person that you are connecting, or the person that you're communicating with, doesn't connect best that way? And so taking some time to listen and understand the emotional context of communication, and being able to be, spending a little extra time listening and understanding what is it that that person needs. That's something that I see from leaders who are struggling, that they're not taking that extra time to connect.
Yeah, it's so true. And I talk about connect before you communicate is kind of the tagline that I've, come up with, and that I talk about. It's exactly in line with what you're saying, and really listening, because I think we reflexively think that communication is about, I'm going to broadcast, and don't really listen enough to what's being said. So I just love that message that, as you point out, just so many people miss, and it's critical. And it also leads into the next question that I have for you, which is storytelling. That's another area on which you focus. And many times listeners are told, make sure to include storytelling and tell some stories, and that makes things more vivid and understandable by their audience. But they don't necessarily understand some of the keys that listeners should remember when they want to relate information, or more generally communicate with others via storytelling. Like, what really makes a powerful story, for example?
This goes back to accessibility again. So if you think about a leader talking about their staying at a 5-star hotel in Monaco and that experience, and using that story to communicate whatever it is they're trying to communicate, that information to their employees is probably inaccessible, and it's not something that they can resonate with. And when you are a strong storyteller, not only are you making your language accessible, but the experience as well. And something that a lot of people don't consider, or that they have trouble understanding, is that no matter what the story is about, and even if it's about you, that your audience is the hero of the story. And that just really means that, is the story accessible to them? Does it resonate with them? So instead of talking about staying at a 5-star hotel in Monaco and not having someone to bring your luggage up 5 flights of stairs and how terrible that was for you, instead talking about a restaurant that you went to and an experience that you had there, because if that's a more accessible experience to the average person. So anytime you're telling a story, just make that story accessible, and make your audience the hero of the story.
Yeah. The audience is the hero, not the speaker. So many people forget that. And, like you were saying with that example, everyone pretty much goes to restaurants, now and again. So that's much more relatable than some resort in Monaco. You were one of the very first to use video on LinkedIn, and you were part of the LinkedIn Live beta testing. Why is video such a powerful communication medium? And also, as a pioneer in that field, what have you learned about video over the years during all the extensive experience that you've had?
Well, there are so many different parts of communication. It comes down to the words that we use, the expressions that we make, the tone that we use in our voice, and body language is such a big part of communication. And when you're using video, people are able to see all of those things versus just using text, or using a photo, or using some other method of communication on social media. And it allows people to connect with you. And the way that you take that to the next level is, when you are recording video, if you're looking directly into the camera, when someone's watching that video, it feels as though you're looking right at them. That's why YouTubers are so popular and so successful, because not everybody, but a lot of people are lonely and they want connection. And if you're looking into the camera, they feel like you're speaking directly to them. So you take this one-on-one experience and make it one to many, so you can reach so many people. And with LinkedIn, what I experienced was that when people had seen my content or the text content that I had posted, but when they saw my videos, they got to see the person behind the keyboard. And it opened up this dialogue that wouldn't have existed otherwise, because as you grow on social platforms, it isn't possible to spend time messaging every single person. And if it is, then you have a lot of time on your hands, or you're very efficient. And so using video allows you to create this connection. People feel like they know you. And I had this incredible experience, and still do, where when I would get on the phone with people, the first thing that they would say is, I feel like I know you. I've seen your videos. And even though we'd never spoken before, it took all of it removed the idea of cold connection, because even though I hadn't had an individual dialogue with them, they felt as though I had through my videos.
So cool. And I wonder, Jaime, if you would feel comfortable sharing a little story that we were talking about offline regarding your mom, and she's a cardiologist, and how she related to her patients.
So my mom was an incredible doctor, and she was a cardiologist, and she worked, I grew up in the Midwest, originally from the East Coast. And she had a lot of patients coming in that were farmers, or who were working in plants, or something of that sort. And they didn't have a lot of medical knowledge. And of course, the medical vocabulary would have been something that was inaccessible to them. So whenever she was talking about the heart and how the blood moved around the body, if she were talking to farmers, she would talk about irrigation and how that was similar to the way the heart worked. So instead of talking about the different valves and pumps in the heart, she would talk about the different valves and pumps used in irrigation, and say, this is much like how your heart is working. So if the valve gets blocked up, there's going to be tension in the irrigation. There's not enough water is going to get out onto the field, and so you have to unblock it. And I mean, this is probably not I'm not a cardiologist. This is probably not a a great example, but she did such a wonderful job of taking something that was familiar to that patient and using that to make what was unfamiliar accessible.
So fantastic and vivid and special. Just great. A reminder for all of us to really think about those issues and how she made it so relatable. And of course, the impact that she had was so much more expansive, and probably people listened and followed her guidance as far as the medication and things like that, because they could really understand it.
Yes. And that you hit on a really important point, and something that I'm really passionate about, and something that I'm working on, is patient provider communication. And it's really hard to go into the doctor and feel like you're being judged and feel like you don't know anything. And suddenly this person who you see is really smart and really accomplished is coming in and telling you that you're doing something wrong. And something that my mom was also really good at was dealing with patients who were overweight or who were obese. And a lot of times there are a lot of stereotypes about these patients within medicine, that they're lazy, that they're not doing what they should. And then they go to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, you need to lose 100 pounds immediately or you're going to die. And so then the patient is depressed, and they go home and they eat more and I mean, that's just an example. Maybe they eat as a way to comfort themselves. And so then you're not fixing the problem. And not saying that, if what she did instead is, someone would come in and they'd be having a lot of issues, and she would find ways to make that information accessible. But then she would say, we've spoken about this before. You know that you need to lose some weight, and I know that's not easy. So we're going to work on this together. And what I want you to do is, the next time I see you, I want to see if you can lose 6 pounds. And I know that that's a lot, but that'll be a great way for us to get on to the bandwagon and have more success as we move down the line. So even though maybe that patient needed to lose 100 pounds, if she was going to see them, in a few weeks or a month, giving them a really accessible goal would make them feel accomplished. And then often they would come in and they would have lost 2 or 3 times that amount, because they would feel like they had an attainable goal. And this is such an important part of strong communication, is giving people goals that they can reach, giving people goals that are accessible, rather than coming in and saying, well, or giving people the mindset to shift for themselves. So someone's saying, I want to be this, and I want to be able to speak in this particular way, and I want to connect in this particular way, and I want people to feel this way around me. that's a really lofty goal. But if we can first start by saying, well, where is it that you feel that you're falling short, and what can we access in that particular area that's going to get you to the next level?
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. It's the we. That kind of message is so empowering and comforting for people. I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but I'm curious as to how your mom came upon this way of interacting with patients, because I mean, I'm a huge believer. I think that is the way to do it, but it's not the typical way of doing it.
I'm not sure how she came upon that particular method, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just the way that she has always communicated,
Mm-hmm.
or the way that she had always communicated that information, or just in general. She really loved bringing people in and bringing people together.
Mm-hmm.
She was not one for small talk. She
Mm-hmm.
wanted to get right to the point, and she wanted to bring people along for the ride with her. So she would do anything in her power to make sure it was accessible. And she also just really loved people, and she wanted people to feel good. And the way to make people feel good is to make them feel included, and then to make information accessible. And that's something that if we go back to where some leaders fall short, is the focus isn't just to share the information, but it's to make the individual that they're speaking to feel good. People love to be acknowledged. And, if you think of the book of How to Win Friends and Influence People, one thing they talk about is using the person's name when you're speaking to them. And you don't necessarily want to use their name again and again and again, because we've all been on one of those calls with customer service where they're like, hi, Jamie, how are you today, Jamie? Jamie, if you could please just do this. And I'm just about to throw the phone at the wall.
Right. So true.
But if someone's speaking to you and they say your name, that feels good, and you actually get a release of neurochemicals when you hear your name, dopamine especially. And so if you're using someone's name when you're speaking to them, if you're including them in the conversation, if you're making them feel good, they're going to be much more receptive to whatever it is that you're sharing with them.
So important. Such a nugget of wisdom. Thank you for that. You're also a LinkedIn learning author, and your course, Connecting with Your Audience Using Video, has been out and very popular. And what can you tell listeners about the course?
So the course has a little bit of something for everyone. It's an intro course, a beginner's course, but if you have been using video for a while and you're not seeing the results that you're looking for, or rather than results, let's talk about the connection that you're looking for, and people aren't connecting with your video. This is teaching you how to modulate your voice, how to relax in front of the camera, how to craft a message that is accessible. All of these things are in there. And the reason that I created it is I know so many people talk about the anxiety that they feel being on camera. They don't like the way they look. They don't like the way they sound. And the overall experience is something they'd like to avoid. And the interesting thing about this is it all comes down to psychology. So we don't like the way that we look or sound because we're not familiar with that person, which sounds pretty funny because we know ourselves. But if we talk about the way we look first, unless we're a supermodel or something like that, we're not perfectly symmetrical. And we spend a lot of our time, the way that we see ourselves is in the mirror. So when we see a photo or when we see a video, we're seeing the flip version. And so we don't recognize that person, and something seems off and we're not familiar. So there's a concept in psychology called the familiarity principle. In social psychology, it's called the familiarity principle. It's also called the mere exposure effect. And the idea is that by the mere exposure to something, we become more familiar with it. And the more familiar we are with something, the more that we accept it. And the more we accept it, the more that we like it. So this is something that I talk about in the course. The more you expose yourself to this person that you don't know, even though that person is you, the more that you will like that. And the same goes for sound, because the way that sound occurs in our body is that it's reverberating off of the bones in our face, and we're hearing it in that space. But when it's recorded on camera, that sound is being compressed, it's being changed. And so it sounds just a little bit different. And then when we hear ourselves or we see ourselves, what's the first question that people ask when they see themselves on camera and they don't like it?
Is that really me?
Yes, exactly. It's always that question. Is that really me? Is that really what I look like? And then the answer is always, yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, that is what you look like. But that's a beautiful picture. You look great. You just don't like it because you don't recognize that person. Or is that what you sound like? And sometimes when it comes to sound, you'll sound just a little bit different on camera, but people will say, "Oh, do I really sound that nasally, or is
Mhm.
my voice that spitty, or any of those sorts of things?" And those things are fine. And what you're noticing, we are, it's cliche, but we're our greatest critics. And when you're focused on all those little things, other people are focused on how smooth your voice sounds, or how calming and comforting it is. Or if you're looking at the camera and you're saying, well, I don't like how my skin looks, or I don't like the gap between my teeth, and someone else is looking at you and seeing how calm you look, and how nice your hair looks, and how you hold yourself. So giving yourself a break when you're on camera is the best thing that you can do. And it's the more that you feel connected to yourself, and this is an interesting thing, the more that you feel connected to yourself on camera, the more people will feel connected to you, because everyone is aware of energy, and they're feeling that energy that you're giving out on camera.
Yeah, I love it. And the more you do it, the more comfortable and known you are to yourself.
Yeah.
I had in a previous interview with Dr. Joe Schran, which is up on the podcast site. We talk a lot about mirror neurons and how we're sort of programmed to react to someone in a way that's similar to their reacting to us. So, like you were saying about, if I feel really connected and comfortable, then that can trigger that feeling in my audience more than it otherwise would. And of course, the negative works too. So just great, wonderful,
Yes.
wonderful advice. So, we've been talking, Jamie, about the power of video, but that is not the only medium that you are leading in. You also are really active on Clubhouse. That's an audio only platform for people who are not familiar, and the popularity of Clubhouse has totally exploded. What do you think, as we sort of shift mediums to audio only, what do you think attracts people to Clubhouse?
The low barrier to entry. That's something that I think really attracts people to Clubhouse. And also just the fact that timing was perfect. And the Clubhouse has been around for about a year and a half, and when it started, I mean, there are a number of different components that added to its popularity. One being that idea of scarcity, where you had to be invited onto the platform, and in the beginning, the caliber of people who were on was so high from an outside perspective, a lot of celebrities,
Mhm.
high profile entrepreneurs, and those sorts of things. So everyone wanted to be in because people love access. They
Mhm.
wanted access to these people. But when also with timing, having having opened up during the 2020 quarantine,
Mhm.
we were all sort of experiencing the collective trauma of being isolated, and f- texting didn't give us the support that we needed, and we were all getting burned out from being on video. So
Mhm.
Clubhouse was sort of the perfect balance in between those two things, where there wasn't a lot of pressure. You could take a call from anywhere, whether you were on a walk or in the bathtub, or anywhere you were. You didn't have to worry about what you looked like.
Mhm.
No equipment was required. You didn't have to worry about lighting. It's just very easy to pop in and join the conversation. And it's a great way to get comfortable and then join in. So you could listen to a conversation and you wouldn't have to be thrust into it. In other words, you wouldn't have to join in if you didn't want to, but once you felt comfortable, you could take that next step.
Mhm. Mhm.
And something that a lot of people talk about when Clubhouse comes up is the serendipity, where you have this opportunity to connect with incredible people. And I actually had this experience. So Amy Cuddy is someone that I really admire, and I watched her video when I was in college, and I've been reading her research for years, and I stumbled upon a room that she was hosting about negotiation.
Mhm.
And because I had information about the negotiation work that I do on my Clubhouse profile, I was invited up to the stage and I got to participate in a conversation with her and share information. And then to my surprise and honor, after that conversation, she followed me on Clubhouse. So I was just like my 21-year-old self on the inside was cheering, remembering being back in college and hearing about her and using her power pose before I had interviews and those sorts of things. And now, I mean, I don't know how much, but in that moment, I was on her radar. And that's something that is happening to everyone. People are making great friends and finding collaborators and getting to brush elbows with people that they admire and people who they never would have access to otherwise, in a way that is non-confrontational and is comfortable. Because, you know, there's a lot to be said about fangirling or fanboying or fan being, I guess, for others.
Sure.
And when you're able to be in the same room with a certain person, and when the conversations on Clubhouse happen in areas called rooms, and you don't have to worry about what you look like, that takes the pressure down significantly. And if you get nervous or if you feel uncomfortable, you can mute your mic and they can't see you. No one knows that you're uncomfortable. So it's great practice in becoming a stronger speaker, a stronger communicator. And even another thing, if you have social anxiety, it's a great way to sort of test the waters and give yourself almost an exposure therapy.
Yeah, I love it. I have spent some time on Clubhouse, not as much as I'd like to. So maybe this conversation will spur me to get back on Clubhouse more frequently, because those are just great opportunities, you know, in various ways to start to build up your confidence and become a stronger speaker while connecting and making the kind of professional interactions that you described. But you also touched upon your consulting work, and you mentioned your negotiation expertise. And, you know, as part of your consulting practice, you help clients navigate difficult conversations, including salary negotiations. A lot of listeners find themselves in those positions, and they can be particularly challenging. How did you develop this special expertise? Because most people run in the opposite direction when a conflict is on the horizon. Not that that's the right thing to do, but it's sort of a human reflex, and you tend to sort of run towards them and help other people do the same.
So it's a funny story. I had the most painful education you could possibly have, but it was a great one. But I've had many careers in my life so far. When I first graduated college, it was at the height of the recession, and I spoke 4 languages, had 3 majors and a minor, and I couldn't get a job. Now, my plan eventually was to go to medical school. And so I thought that I would go and pursue my artistic passions. And I moved to Chicago, and I was in comedy, and I was a competitive salsa dancer, but that doesn't really pay the bills, at least not in the very beginning. So I was trying to get a job, and I was interviewing and I was applying, and nothing was happening. And there was a period of time where I wasn't able to get a job for over a year. And I worked, I think it was a year and a half actually. And, you know, I figured out something in the interim. So I wasn't destitute by any means, but in order to find a career path, that sort of job wasn't happening. And I worked with, I think I applied to 200 or 300 jobs. I worked with over 100 recruiters, 25 agencies, and I still couldn't get a job. And I was thinking, what is going on? And so it was just a lot of trial and error. And I did a ton of research on interviewing and on negotiation and on what can you do to be successful in these situations. So through trial and error, it was the best possible education. And then I eventually did get a job after. It was when I said to my husband that I can't do one more interview. If this next interview doesn't work, I don't know what I'll do. And then that was the job that I got. And so I do really well learning through direct experience, even though in the sense it was very painful, and then through vicarious experience. So asking friends what their experience had been, friends who were successful, and then doing the research about understanding terms like fair market value and understanding what it looks like to negotiate your salary in different fields. So I've had the opportunity, even though I haven't worked directly in these fields, to work with people who are coming right out of college all the way up to the C-suite, and even work with people like attorneys and physicians who, you know, in the case of a physician, they're coming out of their residency or fellowship and they're offered what seems like a ton of money compared to what they've been making previously and with all of their loans, and they accept it only to find that their counterparts, especially their male counterparts, are making, you know, $100,000 or more dollars than they're making. And so they accepted this amount of money thinking that it was a lot, but they didn't understand, they didn't know what the baseline was.
Right.
And so it's through all of these experiences, I've been able to help people get what they deserve and change the conversation around money, because we're taught that talking about money should feel uncomfortable. And if we ask for what we deserve, then we're greedy. When in reality, if we're putting the work in to achieve something specific, we should be compensated for that experience that we have and for our ability to either make change for that company or to achieve whatever goal it is that they have set out.
Yeah, so true. And it reminds me of a couple of things. One ties together some of the strands we've been discussing as far as translation goes, because I remember in one of the courses I was taking in Paris, the French notoriously don't like to talk about money. And so banks in France were having a difficult time. You know, was like this circumlocuted kind of discussion about like, how do we get people to deposit money? And so I remember the professor one day, we're in the lecture hall, and he's like, so this one bank, it might have actually, I think it was a bank that I was banking with, which was called Societe Generale, said, you know, we're interested in your money. And they used the intéressé verb, which, it's kind of, soft, like we're interested like in it, but it has more of a little bit of a harder meaning, not harder, but more of a maybe proactive meaning in French. So they were able to kind of find a verb that could both seem to be like very much in the kind of vein of not being pushy, but also had a connotation of being more active. So they really kind of kicked off this whole marketing campaign using that fit very well, and they did very well with that particular campaign. But I wonder, Jaime, as we sort of wrap up here, you did talk about fair market value as being so important for listeners who are engaged now or will be shortly in some sort of salary negotiation, let's say, or just not job negotiation more generally. Is there one thing that they should really keep in mind as they have these discussions?
There are so many things to keep in mind. So let me think of what would be most important.
Sure. You don't have to limit yourself to just one. I don't want to, I know it's hard, to figure out what that one thing is. So you don't have to limit yourself to just one. You've already given us one, which relates to knowing your fair market value. And, compared to what they're making before, not a lot, but compared to what their value is now, not as much as it should be.
Well, there are a few things to keep in mind. And I think it starts with, when does the negotiation start? And a lot of people think that the negotiation starts once they've been given an offer, once they've been given the amount of money that's available for that position. But the negotiation starts the moment that you begin interfacing with a recruiter or a hiring manager, because negotiation isn't just about money. It's about understanding if you're finding the right job for you. Is this company transparent? Do they value their employees? Or are they simply looking for someone to fill a spot? So asking about compensation is a great way to understand transparency in a company. So for instance, when you're getting started, if you are asking about, what is the range available? Because something that will happen in interviews, and it happens a lot less in the US now, because in a few states, it's actually illegal to ask prospective employees what they're currently making. But if someone does ask you, what are you currently making? You can respond by saying, well, I prefer to be judged based on my expertise and my experience, not my past salary.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you want to just leave out that negative, that just the any sort of negative words,
Mm-hmm.
you can just ask a question back, because the more positive you are, the more positive the other person's going to feel.
Mm-hmm.
And you could just ask a question back by saying, well, what is the I'd be more interested in hearing what is the salary range available for this position.
Mm-hmm.
And when you ask that question, that is going to identify to you how transparent the company is. Because if they respond by saying, oh, well, we can't share that with you, you want to ask yourself, well, why can't they share that information? Are they trying to get you for the best possible deal? And then you can decide, well, is this an interview that I want to continue with? Because if they can't share that information with you, what else can't they share with you? And so then you could come back and say, well, I appreciate where you're coming from. Transparency is very important to me. And I've interviewed at several other companies, and they've all been very upfront with the salary range. Is that something, if you could, I really appreciate if you could share that with me. And if they say that they can't, then you have to make a decision about one of two things. Do you want to continue with the interview? Is this a company whose name on your resume will get your foot in the door and will positively impact the trajectory of your career? If the answer is yes, then maybe you continue with the interview, and then you just take what they say with a grain of salt. You hope for the best, and there's still ways that you can interview at the end, even if they don't give you the number, because when you're looking at leverage in negotiation, you want them to give that number first, so that you're not leaving any money on the table. But if this is a company that can positively impact your career, you can leave that till later. If this isn't if this company doesn't have a name that's going to positively impact you, or there aren't particular skills that you could learn at this company that you couldn't learn anywhere else, something that I always suggest is it's always okay to end the interview. Just like when we talk about in any sort of conversation, it's okay to end the conversation if conflict is going to arise. You don't have to keep yourself in that position, because contrary to what it seems with the work that I do, I really don't like conflict, and I try to avoid it. And a lot of the work that I do helps you to stand up to it while also avoiding it. But in this particular instance, you could say, well, I really appreciate you spending all this time with me. Like I said, transparency is very important to me. If you can't share this information right now, I totally understand. This isn't going to be the best fit, and would love to be in touch with you in the future if that changes. And so you're giving yourself headway, so that you don't have to stand in that feeling of discomfort and continue this conversation you don't want to have, but you're also being polite in not wasting that person's time and not wasting your own.
Yeah. Such a mind expanding commentary, Jaime, really helping us question what, people's norms are about the power that they have, right? And sometimes people underestimate, their own ability to engage in those kind of difficult conversations. So just tremendously useful and insightful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm always happy to share this information, because we don't learn this in school, whether it comes to whether we're talking about negotiating your salary or interviewing or speaking like a leader and connecting with people. Those are things that we hopefully learn along the way or learn from our families. So I'm always happy to be able to share that with anyone who needs to hear it or wants to hear it, so that we can all get more of what we want and, live happier, healthier lives.
And that is best for everybody. That's best for our whole wide world. And we'll have all of the relevant links to Jaime's work through LinkedIn, her LinkedIn courses and so forth, that will accompany the show notes of this episode. Listeners, thank you so much for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.